Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anita Bhela from the University of Delhi, and today we will be doing the module on Henry James's The Art of Fiction. This module has been prepared by Dr. Waliur Rahman from the Central University of Rajasthan, Kishangarh. This module will be elucidating Henry James's The Art of Fiction, and we will also be discussing Henry James's reaction to Walter Besant's essay, The Art of Fiction. In fact, his essay was written almost like a rejoinder to Walter Besant's The Art of Fiction. Henry James, born in 1843, died in 1916, was a British-American novelist and critic. He remained an artistic realist till the end of his writing career. His famous novels were published between 1901 and 1914, The Death of Victoria and the Beginning of World War I. Besides writing novels, Henry James, as literary critic, wrote many critical essays on writers and propagandists. Martha Nussbaum has rightly remarked with reference to the ambassadors, he challenged the conception of rule-dominated moral reasoning. Of course, he is famous as a novelist, but he has written many works on criticism. Let us have a look at some of the works of criticism that he has written. French Poets and Novelists, published in 1878. Hawthorne, published in 1879. Henry James was in fact a great follower of Hawthorne and has greatly appreciated him and has written a lot about him too. Partial Portraits, 1888. Essays in London and Elsewhere, 1893. And Notes on Novelists in 1914. His Views and Reviews, 1908, contains early reviews, introductions, and pronouncements in letters. Some other critical notes, reviews, and episodes were published posthumously. And then we have Notes and Reviews and some other works. One critic has said that Henry James, to his mind, is by far the best American critic of the 19th century, who is brimful of ideas and critical concepts and has a well-defined theory and point of view which allow him to characterize sensitively and evaluate persuasively a wide range of writers, largely, of course, the French, English, and American novelists of his own time. All his life, he was acutely conscious of the low status and condition of English and American criticism and the need of a revival of criticism, especially of the novel. Henry James appreciated a number of authors. He appreciated Balzac, Maupassant, Alfonso, George Eliot, Prescott, Wells, Bennett, and many others for their artistic capacities to represent life. He was not an approval of many of these movements that had started and that were going on during his times, like aestheticism, art for art's sakes, and he ridiculed A.C. Swinburne, Walter Pater, and Oscar Wilde for their literature because he felt that they had made a futile attempt and it resulted in failure of art to represent life in its true account. He praised the concept of the new novel for its actual connection with the realities and the signs of life. In his Notes on Novelists with some other note, he asserts, "Art cannot imitate life. If it does, it becomes a reflection of confusion." This was in much against the school of naturalism. He differentiates the life from art and says, life being all inclusion and confusion, and art being all discrimination and selection. That is, there is much in life, but the artist has to be selective. He has to discriminate, and therefore it cannot just represent life just as it is. He believes that art is a chemical process, the crucible or retort from which things emerge for a new function. That the artist, as an alchemist who renews something like the old dream of the secret of life. In the future of the novel, Essays on the Art of Fiction, James declares that literature is an objective, projected result. It is life that is the unconscious, the agitated, the struggling, floundering cause. And that a novel is, in its broadest definition, a personal, a direct impression of life. The province of art is all life, all feeling, all observation, all vision. It is all experience. That is, everything in life can form a part of the artist's vision. But he has to select according to what he thinks is significant for him. Percy Lubbock, in his The Craft of Fiction, calls James the only real scholar in the art and considers him the novelist who carried his research into the theory of the art further than any other. Maurice Roberts, Henry James's criticism, declares that no critic has ever gone more deeply into the philosophy of art. R.P. Blackmore appreciates James's prefaces to the New York edition of his novels as the most sustained and, I think, the most eloquent and original piece of literary criticism in existence. Henry James's critical essays established him as a canon whose theory of narrative technique, artistry, psychological realism are still echoing in postmodern novelistic discourses of Bakhtin, Jenne, Jameson. In fact, Frederick Jameson has admired Henry James's concept of point of view as a historic act in relation to his interpretation of reification and commodification. As mentioned earlier, Henry James's essay, The Art of Fiction, was in a way a reaction to Walter Besant's essay, The Art of Fiction. When Walter Besant's essay, The Art of Fiction, was written, it was published and reviewed in the Pall Mall Gazette, and later on the ideas were presented in many other newspapers. It did not produce intense debate, that it caused only ripples, not waves. But Henry James saw an opportunity, and therefore he wrote his essay, The Art of Fiction, giving it the same name as that of Walter Besant's, in which he refutes some of the claims made by Walter Besant in his essay, The Art of Fiction. He takes up many of the points that Walter Besant has said about the training of the artist, about the art of writing the novel, and refutes them. The main points made by Walter Besant's essay were that fiction is an art in every way worthy to be called the sister and equal to the arts of painting, sculpture, music, and poetry. That is to say, the field of fiction was boundless, her possibilities vast, her excellencies as worthy of admiration as may be claimed for any of her sister arts. But he also said that since he is equating fiction with the fine arts have rules, and which can be taught. And therefore he felt that the art of fiction could also be taught using rules. And therefore he said that the art of fiction could be taught with as much precision and as much exactness as the laws of harmony, of perspective, and of proportion. Walter Besant said that, like the other fine arts, fiction is so far removed from the mere mechanical arts that no laws or rules whatever can teach it to those who do not already have been endowed with the necessary gifts. That is, those who do not possess an innate and inborn talent for it. So that art lives upon developing arguments, experiments, curiosity, upon variety of attempt, upon the exchange of views, and the comparison of standpoints. This was James's response. Discussion, suggestions, formulations, these things are fertilizing when they are frank and sincere. Literature should be either instructive or amusing. The most important objective of the author is how to make his writing interesting and catchy. The most important principle for James in writing fiction was the aspect of making it interesting so that it appeals to the readers. According to James, the art of fiction also depends upon the power of the artist to experience and feel life. But this feeling of life has to be filtered. James justified the categories of the good and the bad novels. If we go back to Johnson and if we go back to Sidney, we know that many of their earlier artists too were dissatisfied with the kind of literature being produced in their own time. Especially Sidney defended poetry against all accusations leveled against it by saying that it was not the fault of poetry if bad poetry or bad literature was written. It was rather man who was abusing his own wit. And Henry James too tells us that yes, there is infinite rubbish, there is much that is below standard that is being written, but the general reader has the option to reject or accept it. So it is up to the reader to decide what he wants to read, what he finds interesting, what he finds good. James said that a novel in its broadest definition is a personal impression of life. That, to begin with, constitutes its value, which is greater or less according to the intensity of the impression. But there will be no intensity at all, and therefore no value, unless there is freedom to feel and say. He acknowledges that the impression of life, and that impression of life which the artist has to gather, has no restrictions or limitations. Nobody can tell him how to feel, how to experience, and how to say. That is the work of the artist himself. And the execution of that impression of life that he gets belongs only to the artist. It is what is most personal to him, and we measure him by that. What James is trying to say is that we cannot bring external, preconceived ideas to the judgment of a writer. We have to judge him on the basis of what he says, from what we find. The most important thing, according to James, in an author, is the air of reality that he seems to deliver to us. That, for him, is the supreme virtue of the novel, the air of reality that he gives us. And that air of reality has to be defined, chosen, and selected by the author himself. The power to guess the unseen from the seen, to trace the implication of things, to judge the whole piece by the pattern, the condition of feeling life in general so completely that you are well on your way to knowing any particular corner of it. This cluster of gifts may almost be said to constitute experience. And they occur in country and in town and in the most differing stages of education. If experience consists of impressions, it may be said that impressions are experience. Just as, have we not seen it, they are the very air we breathe. Now, in this context, it's important to know that Walter Besant had said that a particular author should, if he wants to write something, write only about that with which he is or she is familiar. That is, if you belong to the country, you should only talk about that. And if you belong to the city, you should be talking only about that. Such kind of restrictions on the writer was something that Henry James did not agree with at all. He said that the impressions of life are gained in myriad ways, in thousands of ways. You yourself must have experienced that your experience of life is not just confined to where you live or with whom you converse. You gain your experience in thousands of other ways, through your reading, through your watching, through knowing about the myths, the legends, the experiences of others. In fact, everything that goes on around you makes an impression of life on you. So how can that impression of life be restricted to a certain area or a certain field? That just is extremely limiting. Henry James also felt that you cannot make distinctions between character, incident, and say that this is more important or that is more important. He believed in the organic unity of the whole. Says when you talk about a picture, then you say one says of character. When one says novel, one says of incident. And then he says, what is character but the determination of incident? And what is incident but the illustration of character? What is a picture or a novel that is not of character? He says that these cannot be separated from each other. James then goes on to consider the distinction between story and treatment. Now, the story naturally represents the subject, the idea, or the donné. Donné is the assumptions on which the work of fiction is based. The starting point of the novel That is, the latter, the artistic shape, the rearrangement, that this subject is given by the novelist. There is no school of thought which suggests, James argues, that a novel should be all treatment and no subject. Naturally, there has to be something to treat. Again, James emphasizes the idea of organic unity. That is, you cannot treat story and treatment as two separate things. The story will be permeated, informed, and animated by the idea. So that every word and every punctuation point contribute directly to the expression. In that proportion do we lose our sense of the story, being a blade which may be drawn more or less out of its sheath. What he's trying to say is that it's not possible to separate the story and the treatment. They form an integral part of each other. And then he gives the example of the metaphor of the needle and the thread. He says no guild of tailors would ever think of the needle without the thread. So similarly, it is not possible to think of the story and its treatment as two separate things. Just as the needle and the thread go together and cannot be separated, similarly the story and the treatment too go together and cannot be separated. Because, as he said, every punctuation mark, every idea, every expression, every detail of language, all contribute to the final impression, and you cannot dissect them into their various parts. Therefore, Henry James emphasizes that a novel, in order to be perfect, will always depend on the liberty of the author and his art of executions. Questions of art are always the questions of execution. Henry James said that all life belongs to the artist. You cannot say that don't talk about pain, don't talk about ugliness, don't talk about things that are not good. He says nothing can be excluded from the author's purview. You cannot shut him up into corners and tell him that this is where reality is, this is where the truth is. No, the truth is everywhere. And that reality is something, which he has to make an effort to catch. It's something superfine and fleeting and turning away your head from the truth of things, and that there is no impression of life in it. He agrees with Besant that the art of rearranging is all important, but not exactly in the sense in which Besant seems to be expressing it. He says art is essentially selection. Yes, it is selection, he says. And this selection has to be typical, and it also has to be inclusive. You cannot see art through rose-colored windows. You cannot pick a bouquet for Mrs. Grundy. As I said earlier, people might say that see only the pleasant things in life. If we go back to Arnold, you remember that he removed Empedocles on Etna from his collection of poems because he felt that it had too much suffering and unrelieved suffering and no action. But James would disagree. He says that the people will tell that art has nothing to do with the disagreeable, with the ugly. They will rattle off shadow commonplaces about the province of art and the limits of art. And he says that when they do this, then you wonder at their limits of ignorance. Again, James tells us that the province of art is all life, all feeling, all observation, all vision. It is all experience. And he says that this would be a sufficient reply to all those who maintain that it is not to touch the painful. And in a very humorous way, he says that such type of people try to put in prohibitory inscriptions on the end of sticks, like they have in public gardens. Do not walk in the grass. It's forbidden to touch the flowers. Do not pluck flowers. You're not allowed to introduce dogs. Please don't stay after dark. It is requested to keep to the right. These kind of prohibitions for the artist are laughable for Henry James. The artist is free to use any impression of life that he has, and he is not constrained to stick to any particular kinds. But of course, they must always be dealing with truth. Henry James tells us that the art of painting and art of fiction are two different genres of art, because the former, that is painting, is more scientific and destined than the other. He says art is not sufficient in itself. Artistry is neither a divine gift nor an inspired one. You remember that Walter Besant said that if you do not have that spark in you, then you cannot be an artist. Henry James feels that that is not true. He says art is the result of innumerable attempts, especially of fiction, with liberty of the author. The author's exercise of freedom helps him to write the interesting novel. An author cannot express all his experiences. And then he gives the comparison with the spider web. He says the artist's chamber of the mind is like that of the spider web, and the silken threads are spread all over. And it catches all the incidents that happen in his experience. Every particle of air of experience is captured in it. Besant talks about this selection as an art of the writer concerning the expression of story. whereas James thinks about the selection, which must be meshed up with the freedom of the author to select whatever he wants to make the novel interesting. He can select any typical sense of reality which enriches the subject of fiction. However, he clarifies that there is no reality which reflects society as it is. As we learned earlier, he said that it would only lead to confusion. He relates the art of selection to the selection of the air of reality, from the immensity of reality to pictorial description of the unseen in the scene, the personal impression of life, and not all of experience. Thus, art is essentially selection, but this selection should be typical and inclusive. This characteristic of an author carries him away from what Mr. Besant termed laws of fiction, harmony, perspective, and proportion. That is, it is not an art which can be taught with precision like that of painting or sculpture. James also dissolved the classical distinction between the novel of character and the novel of incident. And he adores what he calls interesting novel. And he says that all these distinctions that exist are made only for the purpose of convenience, but cannot work when there is talk of the theory of fiction. This division is made between romance and novel. He relates this idea to the term romance, interpreting it as an interesting element in the novels, and therefore he approves and appreciates Stevenson's The Treasure Island. To repeat, the story is an idea that needs a form called the novel. The story is not the soul of novel, but presentation of the story is the soul of artistry of a novel. Henry James defines plot in connection with character. He says, as we have done earlier, what is character but the determination of incident? What is incident but the illustration of character? Next comes the idea of the question of morality. Does the writer of fiction have to have a conscious moral purpose? Is it his duty to moralize or preach to the readers? He says that the only duty and purpose of the author is to make the story interesting and to expose the truth embedded in the so-called truths. How can this be possible? This can be possible only when the author has the liberty to be free for any kinds of thoughts. He says that the art of fiction is related to the execution of fiction, how the writer presents his air of reality. As said earlier, the questions of art are the questions of execution. It is not concerned with issues either moral or immoral. There cannot be any restrictions on the freedom of the art. He cannot be confined to any narrow province. He cannot see art with rose-colored spectacles. He has to see life and experience all aspects of life. We cannot give the artist, the writer of fiction, as any direction as to what to see, hear, and what to write. Thus, there are no limits to the subject matter of the artist. The representation of consciousness has to be the central concern of critical discussion and evaluation. And this idea of James seems to be visionary because he seems to have set the trail for the narrative innovations to come from writers like James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, and William Faulkner, who followed no rules and dealt with the human consciousness in different ways. We know that Henry James was a very famous novelist, but as we have said and studied, he was also a critic. And the art of fiction does not present a complete overview of James's thinking about the novel. In fact, if we take everything together, then he seems to constitute the invention of the discipline of narrative theory. However, a notable omission here is any discussion of the point of view. And this was one of his very important contributions to narrative analysis. However, his views on the point of view developed later in some of the prefaces that he wrote to some of the New York editions of his novels. We know that Henry James's essay, The Art of Fiction, was written as a rejoinder to Walter Besant's essay, The Art of Fiction. James disagreed with many of the ideas expressed by Walter Besant. James tells us that the art of fiction is not akin to the fine arts of painting, sculpture, and music, as Walter Besant would have us believe, and cannot be taught in the way in which the other fine arts can be taught. James also emphasizes the freedom of the artist to experience all life. He says the freedom of the writer of fiction cannot be curtailed. He cannot be given directions. He cannot be told to experience this or that, or to present this experience and exclude that. He cannot be told to look through life through rose-colored spectacles. All that James demands of the novel is that it be interesting. James tells us that there are good and bad novels, and the reader should select that which he finds interesting. James also tells us that a work of fiction is an integral whole. It has an organic unity. Just as Aristotle talked about the organic unity of a work of tragedy. He says that we cannot separate the story and the treatment. They are integral to each other. He tells us that the artist's art lies in his execution of what impressions of life he has. For more details, refer to the e-text. Thank you.